gonna do some more dance moves?
No, I'm not doing any more dance moves. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Munro Live. Today we're looking at the 2022 or 23 model year. I'm not sure which it is actually, Toyota Tundra. So we're gonna walk through the underbody. I'll bring up some suspension points, talk about some architecture elements. So to get started, we'll look at the front suspension system. So relatively conventional. They've got a long SLA system, so short arm, long arm, with a forged aluminum knuckle, steel upper control arm, stamped steel clamshell lower control arm, and obviously the knuckle is forged, as I mentioned. The one thing that caught my eye as I was first looking at these suspension corners was the brake package. So this brake, for those of you who are into performance cars or anything like that, you may notice the brake architecture in that it is a fixed caliper. So fixed caliper means that the caliper bracket itself doesn't move, but that the pistons and the slides move within it. So you don't have any of those like rubber bellows sections on the outside where the brake caliper pins and slides would be. It's all internal to the caliper. So generally speaking, those are going to be more powerful calipers. So in this case, they're going to get better braking force distribution along those pads and less feedback in the braking system because there's less moving components. It's a very robust style system. So interesting that they set this up on a truck. Typically, you would use a floating front caliper like on the Ram, the Silverado, similar competitive vehicles. Past that, we've got a isolated front cradle. So you've got your differential here, and it's mounted to the frame cross members via forged aluminum bracket right here. Then they went to cast bracket right here, so cast iron bracket right here, and then in the front, another cast iron bracket. Interesting choice to go between the forged and aluminum and cast iron. I don't know if that's for joint stiffness or strength or just trying to save cost. But typically those mounts are, if you're going to use forged aluminum, use forged aluminum everywhere, or cast aluminum everywhere. But the fact that they went back and forth is somewhat interesting. And then the one thing I noticed, which is kind of interesting at the rear mount, so this cast aluminum arm reaches up and over and grabs the top of this cross member. You'll note that the front two bolts here are some pretty large hex bolts going up from the top. And then the bolt on the rear is a really long head internal hex bolt. And at first I was looking at it, I'm like, why wouldn't they just use the same bolts? Save cost, increase the volume of the bolts, same tools, right? All of the above. But I think it's actually because this cross member was probably pre-existing given a previous package, and they didn't want to increase the blank size of these. And so they probably did not have tool access. You'll note that the hole around this bolt going up here rides really close to the bolt head. So if you were to have a larger flange bolt like this, it probably wouldn't package in this cross member. So just kind of an interesting point there. But clearly it was a conscious decision as they decided to put that in place. Looking at the front of the vehicle, they do have an active air dam here, so that's not atypical. A lot of their competitors have active air dams. So at low speeds or where you want a better approach angle, meaning the angle by which the vehicle can approach a slope at the front end, if they want a steeper angle for approach, this can go up and out of the way. As you go above a certain speed threshold, or if you put it in eco mode, something along those lines, this will come down, and that's going to give you better aerodynamic characteristics, and that's going to translate into more range for the vehicle overall. From a impact perspective, they've got a rather large aluminum extruded bumper beam, which is attaching to the front end of the steel frame right here, and that bumper beam extends actually even into the wheel envelope in the y-axis, right? So not the wheel envelope itself, I'm simply stating the Y station, or how far outboard that bumper beam goes. So that's going to help them in a SORB event. And another indicator to me that that's SORB related is this little tusk that, or this little beam that juts out from the back of the bumper beam, and this little reinforcement. So they're counting on that during a SORB event, so small overlap rigid barrier, for that beam to engage the barrier at 25% the total width of the vehicle. It's going to bend in towards the beam, and that little beam that was extending off of the back of it is going to collide with the front member of the frame, and that's going to help in the early stages of the event start deflecting off of the barrier, right? So it's going to start a lateral energy transfer of the vehicle and start helping to clear the barrier so that the vehicle is not taking up all of that impact load. The second part of that SORB strategy is back here. So this is quite interesting to me, because if you look at this whole member, this section of the frame that I'm trying to highlight with my hands here, it's very similar to what you would see on a unibody vehicle. So we would typically refer to this area of the unibody, right, if this was just the body structure versus the frame, as the torque box. So in defensive packages for small overlap rigid barrier, the torque box, much like what you're seeing right here, is typically very robust, and they try and get it as far forward in vehicle as they possibly can so as to start absorbing energy and protecting the occupant, which is just rearward of it. And then moreover, they put this triangular shape right here, which is likely designed to deflect the wheel and tire away from the vehicle. One of the biggest issues that OEMs have with mitigating SORB issues is these wheels and tires stacking up against that torque box and starting to transfer energy into the vehicle. So this is clearly a very conscious choice. I'm sure a lot of work went into this section of the vehicle. It's a pretty robust section, interesting execution. So they're kind of bridging the design architecture between unibody and body on frame with this section right here. The F-150, as a corollary, right, has two members, one in front of the wheel envelope and one in the rear, that are simply just beam sections that come out away from the frame. Similar purpose and function, just different design execution. This is quite a bit more robust and extends further fore aft in vehicle. So as we move rearward in vehicle, you know, we don't see these much often anymore, right? These are your catalytic converters for the exhaust system, and then you've got your turbos upstream of this. So this is a twin turbo V6, and if you drive an ICE car, these are predominantly responsible for cleaning up the exhaust gases that come out of it, so that you even get water as one of the byproducts of exhaust. So highly important, highly valuable. So those are quite expensive. One thing that caught my eye, looking at the entire frame and how it was executed relative to, say, an F-150 or a Sierra, something like that, those OEMs, GM and Ford specifically, they allow these frame members and brackets to what we would call slip, or have some manufacturing adjustment that allows those brackets to ride up and down the side members of those frames. When you lock a bracket in on two planes like they've done here, you lose your vertical adjustment capability, because if you, let's say you needed to adjust this member down, now you're no longer in contact with this surface. And since it's welded to this surface, clearly you can't move it up. So the Japanese in general, and I believe this is true with Mitsubishi as well, have a slightly different philosophy with regard to manufacturing. So they will say, we will adjust our tools, we will adjust our fixtures, we will adjust the number of design iterations and prototypes that we build so that we can have what I would call a net build. Meaning, we're not going to design in adjustment with frame members like this, but we intend on getting it perfect such that everything can be built as is with very little adjustment or stack up flexibility in the design. So there's pros and cons to that. A pro to that is you get to do brackets like this, right? So structurally, there's a big advantage to being able to sort of hang off the side and go underneath it, right? Structurally, that joint and this member going to the side frame rail is going to be quite strong. However, if you do run into an issue with tooling, as the parts actually stamped and fabricated, and or in the manufacturing plant as these things are coming together and being fixtured. If something gets bent or, over time, right, things wear out, you can have more issues here because now you don't have the ability to adjust with tools wearing out or fixtures wearing out, things of that nature. So it's a philosophical difference in how you execute from a manufacturing perspective. I wouldn't say that one way is particularly better than the other. They're simply two different philosophies. So as we move rearward in vehicle, this extremely long section right here, this big tank, this is a fuel tank. This is what I would refer to as a cigar style tank, which is simply a, kind of an industry term to indicate the geometry, right? So you'd have a suitcase tank, which is cross car, and it's very reminiscent package-wise of a suitcase. You would have a saddle tank. Saddle tanks, and I know we're talking about ICE stuff a lot, but we don't get to anymore with all these electric vehicles. A saddle tank would bridge across the vehicle, so typically the half shaft, or the prop shaft rather, and some of the exhaust monuments would often go under the bridge section of the saddle tank, hence saddle. So referring back to like saddlebags on a horse, similar strategy. So, but this is a cigar tank. They've got some heat shielding along the side, and then they've got a pretty large aluminum prop shaft. So that's a weight saving function. And you will see with the aluminum prop shafts, the outer diameter, or the OD of these, are dramatically larger than the steel, because if you've looked at structures, the larger the diameter, assuming the same wall thickness, the greater the stiffness and the torsional strength of a member is like that. So when you go aluminum, typically those swell in diameter. Now, if you happen to catch this bracket in the last frame, you may be wondering what that is. So what this is if there's a catastrophic event with the prop shaft, meaning it decouples from the transfer case, which is forward of it right here, it could be very, very dangerous for the occupants. In fact, there's documented instances where these have broken away from their connection at the driveline, gone down, and it will actually catapult the vehicle if it really picks up on something on the ground. So this is a protective measure, saying in the event that we lose connection, this is going to protect you, right? Okay. So obviously we've got exhausts, so it's not true dual. You go to a single exhaust line right here. You got your primary muffler as we move rearward, and oh yeah, they've got one small resonator, right? So typically speaking, the big giant tuning volume, muffler, smaller tuning volume, resonator. And then they just duck out the left-hand side or the driver's side of the vehicle here. One thing that's kind of interesting to me as we get to the rear axle is, one, they've got a solid rear axle. So a lot of people are going away from solid rear and doing similar to the front, where you've got a differential and half shafts coming out. Something that you'll see more and more of as we go with the electrified systems like the Lightning, for example. It's got a differential and gearbox unit in the center, and then they've just got half shafts extending from the side, which can articulate individually relative to the hubs. But the interesting thing about the axle, more than just the fact that it's a solid axle, is it's stamped. So this is a stamped steel and clamshell welded rear axle. So typically on GM, Ford, I think even Nissan, you'll see either a cast aluminum or cast iron differential housing, and then either steel or aluminum tubes being welded or pinned into the side of the differential. The reason being is you can, in a casting, right, you can cast in a lot of the features for your oil drain plugs, different features for electrical, all your bolts, your flanges, even cooling fins, right? So high performance vehicles, you'll see like a grate pattern to dissipate heat. This, you're a little bit more limited, but I will say it's relatively simple, right? There's not a lot of components here. It is quite simple. And then on the leading edge of it, a portion of it is cast as it gets mated to the forward face of the differential. The rear suspension system on this, it does have air suspension. So it's got some air struts right here, as you can see, protected by this little bellows section. And so this is going to accommodate load leveling. So as you pick up a heavier load with a trailer, right, you're towing, you don't want your vehicle to squat so much. This will actually raise the back of the vehicle and level it off for you. And I'll point one thing out to me that's very reminiscent of Toyota. If we duck just a little bit further forward here, this is again kind of one of those philosophical differences. Eric, you may want to swing around the side here. Toyota and a lot of the Asian Pacific OEMs typically opt to add more brackets versus integrate things into larger brackets or larger castings. So if you look at this is the rear stabilizer bar link being attached to the frame. It's attached to a bracket, which is then bolted to the frame. Just forward of that, there's another bracket that's bolted to the frame, which is provisional to attach the fuel tank to the side of the frame. So if you looked at a lot of their competitors, those would be weld-on fixtured brackets, no separate fasteners or anything like that. It's always interesting to me when we used to look at a lot of Toyota body in whites, right? So we'd get all the components off. You'd look at a NAFTA or US OEM, and they would have big, large stampings or castings integrating a lot of features and function into single stampings or pieces. And then you look at the Toyota, and they would have thinner gauge stampings, but they would have an order of magnitude more stampings in some cases that are accommodating all these little features that are all welded to it. But their body in whites were quite efficient from a weight perspective. They just opted to say, well, we're going to do a lot more stampings and a lot less big stampings, so to speak. So we're just seeing some of that show up in the frame here. Okay. One of the last areas that we can touch on as we go to the rear here, I guess two things. We can talk about the spare. There's one comment I wanted to make there. And then right here, we've got the air compressor for the air suspension. Now, I don't see an accumulator for the air suspension system. So to me, that's indicating that they're not raising or lowering this thing incredibly quickly with a separate or remote accumulator. They may just be using one of these smaller cylinders as an accumulator. And they do only have 2 shocks or struts to manage. But typically in an air suspension system, like on the Rivian, like on a lot of the Land Rovers, you'll have a large tube or accumulator that looks very much like a torpedo almost. So interesting to see if that compressor is able to do the duty of a compressor plus accumulator, but they don't need an accumulator, all the better. Last note, looking at this, the spare, I'd be very interested to see another brand new vehicle off of the lot from Toyota, because this chain was hanging down. So this is the chain where if you went to lower the rear or the spare, it's going to help you lower the spare so that it doesn't just fall off the vehicle, and or it's a safety chain. So if something, as far as it being bolted to the frame, disconnects, this is going to catch it so it doesn't become a projectile in the rear. But this is very atypical. If this is actually a production representation, this right here, that is going to cost a lot of NVH issues, and moreover, over and over as this starts to hit and find natural wear patterns, it's going to eat away at the inside of this rim or the wheel, and you're going to have corrosion issues. Most spares, if you look under a vehicle, they're kind of rusty anyways, but I'm just kind of surprised that that's on a production instance. So again, don't know for sure. We'd have to get another production instance of this vehicle to confirm, but that to me is interesting. That's not something I would expect to see on a brand new vehicle. And Eric, you're going to kill me, but I wanted to run to the front for one more thing that I forgot to cover when we were up there. And that is on the sides, and I'll use a laser pointer here, these aluminum members that I'm pointing at right here, those are remote radiators. So with the hybrid system and the twin turbo V6, additional cooling capacity is required. And So what that means is their conventional cooling fan, which is tucked up behind here, you can't see it too well, doesn't have enough heat rejection capability to cool all the systems within this vehicle. So they had to add some additional remote radiators to cool all the adjacent systems. And the one thing to me that when I was looking at the conventional or the standard cooling module is it's still belt driven with a viscous clutch in between the gas engine and the fan motor. So to me it's a very legacy style system. It's less efficient for the vehicle overall. So most of the modern systems, Rivian, pretty much every actually every electric vehicle we've seen, to improve range, they do electric motors, and they're PWM controlled, so they're smart motors. They can have infinite variability in terms of the amount of power that you can give to them at any given time. This, you're much more limited in terms of how you can modulate those fans. So interesting to see. I'm sure they just had some fans in their parts bin or in their existing inventory that they decided to use for this application. So it may be a cost save for them, but it's not an efficiency gain. So all in all, I think it's a interesting application. There's some things on it that frankly kind of make me ask what's going on here or why'd they do that, more so than some of their competitors like say a Lightning or some of the Silverados and Sierras. But and I think the other thing is also if you include the price point of the vehicle, it's quite expensive, coming in at over $70,000 for this particular trim level. But I don't know, we'll see how they do. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you on the next time.